welcome everybody. I'm Fiona Howie. I'm the Chief Executive of the Town and Country Planning Association, and I'm delighted to be chairing the launch of our short film on the role of planning in flood and coastal resilience. So as people will be aware, planning for new places and regenerating existing ones to make them resilient is of course an enormous challenge. But as the film will hopefully highlight, there are things that people can do through the planning process. As you might expect from a 10-minute film, this is very much an entry-level resource for the planning profession, but we hope an important one. And it sits within the context of lots of other advice, which we know exists. And hopefully some of our panel will help signpost people to as well in their contributions later. We developed the film in partnership with the Environment Agency, who I must thank for our ongoing partnership. And the audience for the film will, we hope, be local planning authority officers and elected members in England, as well as planning school students and anyone else with an interest in planning for flood risk. As I mentioned, we've only got an hour today, so the format will be a brief introduction about the project from Julie Foley, who I'll introduce properly in just a second. We'll screen the film, and then following that, we'll invite some initial responses from our fantastic panel. There should be a little bit of time to put questions to our panel, so please do put those in the Q&A function, which should hopefully be available at the bottom of your screen. We'll also be sharing the link to the film in the chat function as well, so hopefully people will have that available to them. And I should highlight that we're recording the session and we'll make it available online after today. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who's Julie Foley, who's Director of Flood Risk Strategy and National Adaptation at the Environment Agency. Julie is responsible for leading the development and delivery of the agency's flood and coastal erosion management strategy, working with government, risk management authorities and other partners. This includes ensuring the Environment Agency's work on flooding and coastal change in planning and adapting to climate change and enabling climate resilient places. Welcome, and over to you, please, Julie.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Fiona. It's a great pleasure to be here today, actually, and to be part of launching this video. And I really want to thank all the other speakers who are here to support this initiative as well. As Fiona was saying, we've worked with the TCPA for a number of years now to raise awareness and understanding of flood risk, coastal erosion and climate change. And we're really hoping this video will enable us to reach a much wider audience in a more accessible and engaging way. And it absolutely underpins the messages in our National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy. And planners and developers have a really vital role to play. So it's great to be part of this today. I just wanted to make a few brief points on the drivers for the video, to signpost some things that we're also working on, and to very briefly touch on some of the things we should be thinking about into the future. So turning to the first of those, we did a review on policy and practice on flood risk and development planning with DEFRA and the Department of Levelling Up and Housing Communities last year. And that actually gave us a really good grasp of what's working well and where there's room for improvement. One of the key things it showed is that there are remaining significant gaps between what policy says and how it is put into practice through implementation locally. We also got very clear feedback, understandable feedback, in fact, that local planning authorities have significant workload pressures and resource pressures more generally. And this was reflected in some of the responses. So over 70% of local planning authorities said they needed more training on flood risk and climate adaptation. Nearly 2/3 said they needed better access to expert advice on all sources of flooding, actually particularly around surface water. And only 12% of local authorities actually strongly agreed that they had the skills and expertise they needed to be able to better account for flood risk and climate change in their planning decisions. And that was one of the key motivating factors for this video, but also other work that we're taking forward. Just to briefly touch on those. First off, we know as the Environment Agency that one of our key roles is to keep providing the best possible information on flood risk modelling and mapping to inform decision making. And we've been working very closely with lead local flood authorities in the last year to improve and enhance surface water flood risk mapping notably. We've also been enhancing and improving our digital services So we have something called the Flood Map for Planning as a digital service that's on gov.uk, and it freely provides information, data, and information that helps to support support flood risk assessments, and that is freely available. And we continue to iterate our guidance on climate change allowances to respond to the very latest climate science, so that developers and planners can guide the location and design of new development in a way that's safe throughout its lifetime. And in fact, we very recently actually updated those allowances to account for the latest information on peak rainfall intensity, which will improve our understanding of surface water flood risk and help inform planning options for sustainable drainage, which is a very important area. And we've been working with partners like our colleagues in ADEPT and Hannah and her colleagues to provide best practice on things like strategic flood risk assessments that are so very important to informing strategic decision choices through local plans. So that's just a signpost, some of the things we're doing, and no doubt you can ask some further questions about that later. If I just very briefly touched on some of the things that we are really interested in seeing through the planning reforms that are coming forward, and Joanna particularly may cover this a bit later. I think one of the four things I would pull out, the first is around making sure that avoidance as a principle continues to underpin our approach to flood risk and planning. The sequential test here is incredibly important. Ultimately, it's about steering development to the lowest areas of flood risk. But we also know that test is applied somewhat inconsistently around the country. So some greater clarity and more consistent application of that test would be very welcome. We'd also like to see statutory consultee gaps closed so that local planning authorities have the best available information. We in the Environment Agency are the advisors for risks from rivers and the sea, but there is a gap for statutory consultee role for areas at risk of surface water flooding. Yet that is one of the fastest growing areas of flood risk. And alongside that, there are clearly opportunities to look at more multifunctional sustainable drainage systems that not just enhance flood resilience, but contribute to local nature recovery and carbon sequestration. And we'd like to see greater emphasis on pre-application consultation. The review that I mentioned last year identified that the Environment Agency is actually only asked to provide pre-application advice in 1 of 5 flood risk planning applications. Yet a very large proportion of the applications where we lodge an objection is due to inadequate flood risk assessment being undertaken. That clearly could be resolved through early pre-applications engagement. And finally, thankfully, in most cases, our flood risk advice is followed by local planning authorities, and we've got some very, very good relationships locally. But on those rare occasions where it's not, local planning authorities are required to refer major developments for potential call-in by the Planning Secretary of State. There's clearly some opportunities to look to strengthen that call-in process and perhaps make it more visible. And there's also an argument that perhaps it should be expanded to encompass not just current flood risk, but future flood risk in light of the climate change challenges that we're facing, as well as some smaller scale developments, and particularly vulnerable developments linked to homes. So those are just some of the ideas that we would really welcome some further conversation around, perhaps through this event and in other forums. But Fiona, I'll hand back to you, because I think at this point, it'll be great to watch the video and see how that will help.
Thank you, Julie. That was really useful context, and great to bring in the planning reform agenda nice and early in the session as well. Right. So hopefully Jessie is now going to show the film, which is about 10 minutes long. And then after that, I will introduce, as I mentioned, our panel to respond.
The climate crisis is intensifying, and the impacts can be life-changing for many communities.
The thing that I completely underestimated was how this has actually affected my children.
The challenge can feel overwhelming, but we have to rise to it so future generations can have a hopeful and a sustainable future. We must put climate change at the heart of all the decisions we make. There may not be a single silver bullet, but we do already have a range of powerful solutions that can get the job done.
Flooding is among the most serious impacts of climate change. It has devastating and long-lasting impacts on people and their communities, as well as major impacts on our economy. In this short film, we want to highlight the steps you can take through the town and country planning process to enable sustainable and climate resilient development that will help us not just survive our changing climate, but to thrive in it.
Flooding can come from a number of sources, from rivers spilling into their floodplains, high tides and storm surges inundating coasts and estuaries like this. Flooding can be caused by rainfall running off land, drainage systems being overwhelmed, or groundwater rising from below. Planning decisions have to account for all sources of flooding and how risks may change over the long term. Whilst flood defences like these reduce the chances of flooding, they can never remove all the risk. So even when areas are protected by flood defences, we still need to carefully consider the remaining risks.
When floods hit, they can cause devastation, damage, disruption and despair. And sadly, sometimes they take lives. Over 5.2 million homes and businesses in England are at risk of flooding. The number that could be impacted indirectly is likely to be much larger. For every person directly affected during a large flood, about 16 more suffer knock-on effects like power cuts, toilets that won't flush, or impassable roads that stop people accessing the services they need.
The devastating floods of 2007 caused around £4 billion worth of economic damage. People were displaced from homes for 9 months on average, with a quarter of homeowners uninsured or underinsured. These have been followed by major floods nearly every year since. In fact, the Met Office estimates that there's now a 1 in 3 chance of rainfall records being broken somewhere in England and Wales every winter.
There are also many costs that are much harder to put a price on. Exposure to floods and storms increases the chances of poor mental health by around half, and these effects can still be seen 2 years after flooding.
We've been flooded twice in 9 months, and you just think that when you're in your own home, you should that's the place you should feel the safest, shouldn't you?
It didn't really affect me until a year or so later, because I was exhausted by it all, physically exhausted, mentally exhausted. You get distracted emotionally and in a business sense, and it's very difficult to retain focus when you've got this elephant in the room, which is getting your business up and running again because you've had a flood.
The challenge we face to achieve a resilient nation is already a huge one, and we aren't always helping ourselves. If existing development trends continue in line with projected population growth, we're likely to see a near doubling of properties on the floodplain within the next 50 years. And this doesn't account for the predicted effects of climate change.
The Environment Agency provides expert flood risk advice to inform local planning authority decisions on planned development. We also help decision makers and developers by translating the latest climate science into user-friendly guidance, which sets out how climate change could affect the causes of flood risk in future. The latest climate projections for the UK confirm we can expect warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. This is likely to lead to more surface water and river flooding, but also to more heat waves and droughts. We could also see more than 1 metre of mean sea level rise this century, which would increase the risk of flooding on our coastlines, estuaries and tidal rivers, and speed rates of coastal erosion.
The National Climate Change Risk Assessment puts flooding and coastal change among the top climate risks we face as a nation. Global temperatures are rising, and without rapid, concerted action, both to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prepare for the impacts already locked in, there's a risk the climate emergency could spiral out of control.
Our National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy sets out a vision for a nation ready for and resilient to flooding and coastal change today, tomorrow, and looking out to the end of the century. The investment that we have made in recent decades in flood and coastal risk management is making a difference in better protecting properties and infrastructure right across the country. But we know that in the face of a changing climate, we cannot expect to build our way out of the climate emergency. It's vital, therefore, that we look to a broad range of flood and coastal resilience actions into the future. That may be nature-based solutions that help to reduce the flow and store floodwaters. It may be sustainable drainage systems that help to tackle surface water flooding. Planners and developers have a vital role to play, particularly in terms of avoiding inappropriate development in high areas of flood risk and coastal change. Getting the right growth in the right places will be fundamental to creating climate resilient places.
So we know we face a daunting challenge, but the question is, what can we do through spatial planning to help create safe and resilient communities?
The first stage of tackling flood risk is to understand the current risks and how those risks will change over the long term. This is done through strategic and site-specific flood risk assessments to inform local plan preparation and decisions on individual planning applications. Once the risks have been understood, the most effective approach is to avoid them. The sequential test is the tool used to steer development to areas with the lowest flood risk. Doing so minimises the chances people, homes and businesses will be affected by flooding. It also minimises future need for costly and often carbon-intensive flood defences, which can contribute to the causes of climate change. If the sequential test shows there's no option other than to consider development in flood risk areas, it has to be shown that the development will be safe throughout its lifetime, usually a minimum of 100 years, without increasing flood risk elsewhere. In some cases, such as new homes in Flood Zone 3, an additional test, called the exception test, also has to be met. The test demands that development must provide wider benefits to the community, which outweigh the flood risks. It also requires development to reduce flood risk overall, wherever this is possible.
In summary, in order to justify these types of development in flood risk areas, they really have to be of exceptional quality. So when development is absolutely necessary in flood risk areas, what can be done to reduce the impacts of flooding and help create healthy and beautiful places to live?
Buildings should be laid out on a development site to avoid the areas of highest risk and to make space for water to flow and be stored. They should be designed so that the floor levels are above the estimated flood level and that the most vulnerable aspects of development are moved to upper floors. Construction materials that keep water out can help to minimise damage. But where that's not possible or safe to keep water out completely, resilient design and materials can help speed reoccupation and recovery after a flood.
Development also has the potential to increase flood risk elsewhere. So how can we design places to ensure this doesn't happen?
Developers need to mimic natural drainage. This is where water's gathered off surfaces like roads and roofs and collected in what we call sustainable drainage features. Some of them are here behind us in Sheffield. These are capturing the water, slowing it down, allowing it to soak into the ground, but they're also providing lots and lots of other benefits. You can see they're attractive features, they're providing biodiversity, they're allowing naturally irrigated vegetation, and they're providing cool environments, and obviously integrated into development are a really positive contribution to those areas.
Unfortunately, it's not sustainable to defend some of our existing places from the risks and impacts of flooding and coastal change, which are expected to increase due to climate change. Planning plays a crucial role in helping those communities confront these challenges and find solutions that enable them to transition away to more sustainable locations. Our local plan policies make it easier for residents and caravan parks like this to roll back as the coastal roads and sea levels rise.
We knew there was both short and long-term risks to building here, so we designed the building to be resilient and adaptable. It's raised off the ground so it can withstand the sort of flooding we anticipate over the next 20 years. Our planning permission also means that we have to review the risks every 5 years. When the risk becomes too great, the way the building has been constructed means it can be relatively easily relocated. We want everyone to enjoy Spain for many, many years to come.
We know the scale of the threat. We know we need to act quickly to make the changes necessary for our survival. Our core messages are clear. Use flood risk assessments to understand the risks we face now and over the long term. Pick the right location for development avoiding flood risk areas wherever you can. If development in flood risk areas is necessary, ensure it's designed to keep people safe, minimise damage and speed recovery. All of this helps build resilience in our communities. Working together, we have a real chance of a sustainable future. Time is really short, and one thing is certain: failure is not an option.
Great, thank you so much. I will introduce the panel in just a second. I'm conscious that there's quite an interesting discussion going on in the chat around statutory consultees and the role of lead local flood authorities, which we will try and pick up in the Q&A in the discussion after our panel. And again, if people have specific questions, please do put them in the Q&A. But first of all, I will introduce our first panelist. Lost my notes, who is Adam Gardner, who is the Senior Analyst, Health and the Built Environment within the Committee on Climate Change, where he leads their work on health and the built environment. Prior to joining the committee, he worked in BEIS on building decarbonisation. So welcome, Adam, and we welcome your thoughts and reflections.
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks for having me to come here to respond to the video and also speak at the event. I thought the video was truly excellent. Flooding is, of course, a really, really complicated problem. And I thought the video hit all the correct notes in describing the main sources of flooding and how flooding affects the UK, kind of both now and how it might in the future. It's really easy to talk about some of the economic damages from flooding. And I thought the video really beautifully described as well some of the real impacts of flooding on people's health and well-being, which maybe aren't so easily quantified, but are incredibly important. And I thought it was great to see that, given the prominence within the video. And finally, yeah, the video also just really helpfully explained the important role that the planning system has, and it really, to me, really made the kind of solutions very digestible and easy to understand. So I think there's actually quite a lot we could learn maybe within the Climate Change Committee about how to communicate our information in a really easily digestible manner. So yeah, I thought it was great. I thought I would use the kind of slides I've brought here to set out some evidence that we published last year from our latest climate change risk assessment, which explains, I suppose, starting with the impact of different potential warming scenarios and the different hazards which might come from them. And I've also got a couple of slides which set out maybe some of our more specific evidence on flooding specifically. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, can we skip forward? I think the slide has stopped sharing. I've got the slides up, I can share them from my screen if that would be easier.
I think it best try that, Adam, if you can. As you guys, it's having a problem.
Okay, have they popped up on the screen?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so yeah, as I said, I thought I'd start off with just setting out some information, thinking maybe more generally at some of our evidence and how potential future temperatures are going to rise in the future going forward. Now, I know a lot of you have seen this chart or different forms of this chart multiple times before, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but there's a couple of key things that I think are kind of important to kind of set the context maybe for this video and the discussion that we're going to have today. So I suppose the first one is, so these temperatures are kind of relative to kind of pre-industrial levels, and we can see that we're currently about 1.2 perhaps degrees already above pre-industrial levels. And there's two pathways which are shown here. So in the green, we've got our current global ambition scenario, and we can see kind of temperatures rising quite significantly towards the end of the century. And then this orange path here is a Paris Agreement scenario. So this is keeping temperatures to about 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I think a really important feature and a kind of key takeaway maybe from this chart is, if you look at the pathways, they really start to diverge from around 2050. So it's in the second half of the century where you really see the kind of big divergences. Which means, I guess it shows a couple of things. It shows that we really need to work on emissions reduction to get as close as possible to that orange Paris Agreement scenario pathway as possible, but it also shows that irrespective of what emissions pathway we end up on, there's going to be a level of warming. And with the level of warming, which is already kind of baked into the system, we're going to realize different hazard changes as well, up to 2050 as well, which really shows the importance of adaptation as well as working on emissions reduction. Now, this next chart, this next slide here kind of shows how some of the key hazards in the UK due to climate change may be expected to change over time as well. So kind of key hazards which are on this slide are temperature rises, hot summer occurrences, and changes to rainfall and sea level rises. So the second column here is shows potential changes from the from increased temperatures by the mid-century. And as I said, this is kind of irrespective of emissions reduction scenarios. And we can see what was mentioned in the video, which is we're going to have these hotter, drier summers, and we're going to have these warmer, wetter winters. And if you look to the bottom few rows, you can see kind of increases in rainfall, there's increases in intensity of rainfall that we expect to see as well as some sea level rises, all of which are going to increase flooding risk. And if you look to the columns on the right, which is setting out the potential increases in the risk under both a 2-degree and a 4-degree warming scenario, you can really clearly see how the risk increases significantly in the 4-degree warming scenario as well. So that's kind of setting out some of the kind of more general changes in UK hazards due to climate change. I thought I'd also, as mentioned, describe some of the evidence that we published last year alongside our climate change risk assessment on the present and future impacts of flooding in the UK. Again, a lot of this stuff was presented in the video as well, but I think really key to really highlight the urgency of action in this area. So the risk to flooding on people, communities and buildings is one of the most severe out of all the risks that we presented within the climate change risk assessment. And this risk is really severe both now and it will be in the future. So some 1.9 million people in the UK are at risk of flooding now. And the maps on the right-hand side of this slide show how in a high emission scenario, this will increase over time. So the left-hand side is current picture, the middle shows the 2050s and how the number of people who are going to be exposed to flooding risk is going to increase over time. And in the 2080s, you can see the colors on the map are really kind of increasing in scale, and you can see flooding risk really increasing across country. The second key point to bring out here is that, and again, this was mentioned within the video, is that flooding is going to lead to tangible direct damage and economic costs to the country, such as physical damage to buildings and assets, but also really important intangible impacts that aren't easily quantified or monetized, such as the impacts on people's health and well-being. And again, we saw this described so well in the video. Flooding also leads to indirect impacts to the economy, such as transport or electricity disruption. And the chart on the right-hand side shows, again, some of the analysis we published last year, and this is the expected annual damages from flood risk, and this is split by different sources of flood risk. So we can see that So we can see that flooding from rivers is the dominant source in terms of potential damage, but surface water flood risk accounts for a greater number of properties at risk, and you can see the numbers are incredibly high as well. So the final point I wanted to end on is just really simple, I suppose, and kind of how the video ends, which is the planning system is one of the key tools available to us to adapt to this really important climate risk. I'm sure we're going to hear more about this in the rest of this session as well. So planning can direct development away from areas of flood risk, which is incredibly important. And it can also ensure that where development needs to take place in areas of significant flood risk, that flood risk is mitigated and kind of resilience and resistance measures are included into developments where possible. So that's the end of my presentation. Yeah, thanks again for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Adam. Plenty of questions now coming in through the Q&A, but we will go through all of our respondents first and then we'll try and clump some of those together. So next up we have Joanna. Welcome, Joanna. Joanna Aveley has been Chief Planner in the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities since September 2020. She's a town planner with 30 years experience working across government, major projects and with local authorities. She's been involved in all aspects of planning research, policy, practice and project delivery. So over to you, Joanna.
Thanks, Fiona, and it's a real delight to be with you today. And just thanks for a fantastic video. We're just super conscious that we are all facing, you know, some pretty astonishing and as you said in the video, daunting prospects in terms of how we deal with climate adaptation and still meet our needs for shelter, our needs for food, and our needs for the needs of the planet and the needs of nature. So a few sort of personal observations, and I'm just going to loop back to the policy context, I suppose, to give colleagues real confidence that the framework within which you can make decisions is really clear on this particular issue. So two personal observations. When I went to a conference in Amsterdam in about 2003 and it was a sort of European-wide conference around lots of different issues. And I think it was one of the first times when sort of the risk of flooding in a modern economy and in a modern country became really apparent to me, and what we have to do as whichever roles we're in, as citizens, as public officials, as developers, and so on. And there was a session led by it was colleagues from Holland and Germany who had a program where they did training for children and young people as to how to escape in a flood event from their home. And it was incredibly stark because what they basically did was talk about the 5 minutes of notice that you might have. And I think what at that point, and then obviously subsequent to that, we've just become so aware of our changing climate and some of these issues that we thought might be distant and might be for someone else to worry about are coming to our neighbourhoods. And obviously when it comes to rain intensity, if anybody was anywhere near London yesterday, I would have what we refer to as biblical rain yesterday, where it's things that we would refer to as tropical rain, but they are in our those sorts of changes in our climate experiences are there for us all to see. So what does it mean for us? I think individually, just to sort of comment about individually for a minute, we make little decisions which count. And I don't know if anybody's seen, but a really powerful one of the gardens at the Chelsea Flower Show this year has got London Fire Brigade colleagues standing around a Chelsea Flower Show garden, which has two elements to it. One side is a front garden in water with hard paving and a car in half flood. And the other side is a garden with soft landscaping, planting, and obviously able to absorb general runoff and rain. So we do, all of us do, we make small decisions, don't we, that impact on things, particularly sort of surface water. But what this session is also about is obviously the big decisions that we make as professionals and as elected members and elected councillors and so on. And those, as has been really well presented, are about where we put development and how we then design that development. I was in a really powerful session yesterday with colleagues from across the industry, actually, and remind us of two things. And Fiona, I'll say this on your behalf. You know, the origins of the TCPA are in that relationship between people and nature, shelter and nature, and I suppose that's something that we're rediscovering. We rediscovered it personally through the pandemic, and we're now in this conversation understanding it better in terms of how we deal with the challenges of climate change. So what are these big decisions, and where's the policy framework which gives hopefully people on this call confidence to plan properly for climate adaptation and flood risk, and then to follow it through in terms of decisions they make for individual projects and schemes. You all know this, but section 14 of the NPPF is really strong and simple on this matter, and basically talks about plans should take a proactive approach to mitigating and adapting to climate change. It's really clear. And space should be made for physical protection measures. I just refer you to these paragraphs. They're incredibly strong. So if there's any doubt at a local level when you're talking about your plan preparation and whether this is a current issue, that is for people to consider, be in no doubt. And then when it comes to development itself, that it should avoid increased vulnerability to the range of impacts arising from climate change. And then it goes on to talk about including through the planning for green infrastructure. And then obviously aspects to do with actually, which as Adam was talking about, how we try and keep within 1.5 and actually are directly addressing issues to do with increased greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So I suppose what I'm saying is that national policy framework is really quite strong. And over last summer, we did some amendments to the NPPF, which were really important. And aligned to that, last summer, we also issued the National Model Design Code. And again, if colleagues haven't had a chance to absorb some of the detail, I will refer you to page 27 in part 2. And the reason I just mention that specifically, because it makes it real, some of the things to watch out for in terms of what should be delivered through schemes. As we make some of those bigger decisions around how we lay out new development, how we think about schemes, how we judge whether they're dealing with these issues, and how we follow through in terms of whether those schemes deliver through, particularly post-permission, checking on conditions and how things actually then are delivered on the ground. And the reason I raise it is because it's actually in the section that's about nature and biodiversity, but it's just a really good aid memoir. It talks about suds and gardens, trees and hedgerows, planting, creating habitats, and enhancing habitats. Rivers. So as we've heard, the planning of the green and the blue infrastructure alongside the red brick and the Cotswold stone. So as people know, we are increasingly focusing on the design of the landscape and the spaces between our homes and our buildings as much as we are the buildings themselves. And that is really got to be a focus, particularly given the conversations we're having today. So just to touch on a couple of other things which I think are highly relevant, and a huge thanks to Julie and colleagues around the work they've been doing around digitisation. As colleagues will know, we're doing a lot of work around making sure that this sort of really rich and important data is available to colleagues. And so to some extent we can fast track the analysis bit of our processes and get straight into figuring out how we mitigate, how we plan for, how we adapt, how we positively address some of these challenges. And we're doing that in all sorts of ways here and now within the planning system. And you'll be aware of various programmes that we've got ongoing. But our objective is to continue to support local authorities and local communities to be able to access that data in a really meaningful way and put it into plan making and analysing these issues in a spatial way. Because as the video really concluded, spatial planning is a huge lever and a huge part to play in these conversations. And then just to reflect on another thing, striking that maybe only 12%, as was mentioned, of local authorities feel confident in dealing with some of these issues as they particularly maybe are judging on flood risk with projects and so on. And I think what we're working with many people across the industry on is, and this video is a fantastic contribution, is making information accessible, having a collaborative approach to getting good practice out there. Congratulations for this session. This is exactly the sorts of things we can now do we can share know-how, we can share knowledge, we can advocate, we can also have a conversation about how to make judgments about things that are important through planning. Planning judgments are always ultimately a decision about balancing different competing needs, different competing demands, different risks, different mitigations, different opportunities, and it's about giving people confidence in that decision making and feeling that they have the data available to them, that they have the policy framework within which to help those decisions to be made, but also ultimately being confident that you can make the decisions that are good for communities, good for the quality of the places that we're creating, that they're built to last, and that is good for nature and the environment, and that addresses these changing aspects of our environment, which are very apparent to all of us now. So huge thanks to Fiona and colleagues. It's great to be part of the conversation, and I look forward to taking some questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Joanna. And finally, I want to introduce Hannah Bartram, who's Chief Executive Officer of ADEPT. I'm sure most of the audience will know what ADEPT is, but just in case, it's the Association of Directors of Environment, Economy, Planning and Transport. Hannah joined ADEPT originally as the Chief Operating Officer in February 2016. Prior to that, she worked at the Environment Agency, where she led various national teams working on policy areas, including planning, growth and devolution, climate change and flood risk management. So all very topical for today. So welcome, Hannah, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be joining you today. Thank you for explaining what ADEPT stands for. It's a bit of a mouthful. It is the professional membership body that represents directors of place from county, combined and unitary authorities across England. So many of those, of course, are local planning authorities. Just a bit about ADEPT, in case you don't know, we now represent 3/4 of strategic authorities outside of London, including those councils with experiences of big floods and recovery. And I think Gloucestershire was referred to, 2007, but more recently Somerset, Cumbria, and other authorities that are leading big projects as part of the EA's £5 billion+ 6-year investment programme, such as South Gloucestershire and Portsmouth. Just in terms of how we work, so the networking element of ADEPT is the backbone. So we have 6 regional boards, 4 national subject boards, including environment, and various technical groups, including flood and water management and planning, where we get representation from the EA, for example. We have an R&D programme that's currently focusing on innovation within the local highway sector via a £23 million DfT funded programme. And we shared our experiences of programme management with the EA when it was developing the £150 million DEFRA funded flood and coastal resilience innovation programme. We also seek to influence policy development. So with such a broad portfolio, we face into 5 government departments, including DfT, DEFRA, DLEP, but also BEIS and DSMS, and obviously their delivery bodies as well. And we look to collaborate with other bodies such as the Climate Change Committee, Office for Environmental Protection, and professional bodies such as the TCPA. So, as you will be more than aware, many local authorities have declared climate emergencies, and they have targets that they want to stick with despite COVID. And climate change, I don't need to tell you this, remains our biggest long-term challenge, and that's both in terms of reducing emissions as well as making places more resilient to what I call baked-in climate change. So I was delighted to be asked to give a response to today's launch of the TCPA and EA new video resource. So a film that expertly describes the role of planning in flood defence and coastal resilience is a really valuable resource in explaining the often mystical, complex, bewildering, dysfunctional, take your pick, role of planning, as it's really easy when you're working within the system to lose sight of how it's viewed from the outside. And then across the ADEPT membership, we're striving to follow best practice and to link together all the various components of what is a complex jigsaw. But councils are not always perfect, of course, and there are instances where there are clearly gaps. So just some specific comments. So the NPPF is clear in terms of the sequential and exception tests. So the challenge for ADEPT members is the rigour to which those tests are being applied, particularly or especially where the local plan may be out of date or councils have failed the housing test, the housing delivery test, and are under extreme pressure to deliver numbers of new homes. So in this context, it's invaluable to be able to present what good looks like. Our challenge in terms of the NPPF is also to ensure that local authorities have the skills and capacity to apply a level of rigour and scrutiny to properly assess the risks against, for example, the wider sustainability benefits to the community stemming from development. So that statistic that Julie referred to, 70% of local planning authorities wanting more training, that really highlights that issue. And I think everybody knows there is a workforce issue in the planning world, as there is across all elements of local government delivery, actually. We're seeing growth in which is becoming known as a stacking and bundling of benefits. So where, for example, you've got rural and urban sustainable drainage schemes, which are providing for the attenuation of flood flows, but they're also helping to improve water quality, the natural environment, decrease soil erosion, and in some cases are providing a source of carbon sequestration as well. But these tend to be showcase projects. So our challenge here is to make them business as usual, particularly where they require funding and coordination between multiple agencies and tiers of local government. And I think this transformational role sits at the heart of ADEPT, actually. It's already been referred to, but perhaps a new Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill will help in this regard. It makes provision for the new infrastructure, the new proposed infrastructure levy to be used for facilities and spaces for the mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. So that would obviously include SEDS and other infrastructure for flood and coastal resilience where the impact is climate related.
Sorry, Hannah, to interrupt. Your mic is really muffled. I don't know if...
Can you hear that now? Is that better?
Still really muffled, sorry.
Sorry, okay. It must be, maybe that's because, is that better now?
I think that's a bit better, yeah.
Sorry, you should have, apologies, I should have stopped me beforehand. So just to finish this, so it's easy to focus on the mitigation side of climate change whilst overlooking the Cinderella topic of adaptation. The government's third climate change risk assessment, which was published earlier this year, sets out the challenge that faces all of us. To quote, whilst we aim to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the evidence shows that we must be prepared for warming up to 4 degrees Celsius. So this short sentence of 20 odd words should send shockwaves through the system, given the implications for extreme weather events and coastal flooding. So clearly, not only does planning sit at the heart of this adaptative work, but decisions relating to project funding and evaluation are also crucial. So ADEPT's already working as part of the local adaptation advisory panel to make planning a key feature of the third national adaptation plan. And we'll look to work with DEFRA and DLUC to develop best practice in order to support and operationalise the NAP when it gets published in summer of next year. So just to say thank you once again for inviting us to comment. It was a great video and really valuable resource, and we'd be really happy to help promote the video resource too. Thank you.
Thank you. So as I said, we've got about 10 minutes for questions. So we've had quite a lot, so I'll try and sort of clump some of the themes together perhaps and see how we get on. So there's been a bit of a discussion in the chat, and I know Sam, who people will have hopefully realised was starring in the video as well, as tried to pick some of them up, but I think it's probably just worth picking up. So I know, Julie, in your comments, you made the point around the gap.
Sure.
And of course, people have raised the role of lead local flood authorities, but also, I suppose, EA, local planning authorities. There are a lot of people involved, and there's lots of strategies, and they will overlap. So I just wondered if you might comment on some of that sort of...
I will just quickly clarify, though, so that you're right, Fiona. So for those just want to get a bit more detail, Sam Kipling has put more information in the chat. So perhaps in the time available, it's difficult to provide so much detail, but just to be clear, so the Environment Agency is only a statutory consultee on development at current risk of flooding from rivers and the sea. We're not a statutory consultee for development at risk of surface water flooding, and that was the main mind the gap point that I guess I was making. Lead local flood authorities, of course, have an important role, but they're statutory consultees on major development involving surface water drainage. So they will promote things like sustainable drainage systems, which are also terribly important and we want to encourage. But in terms of having a statutory consultee for areas at risk of flooding from surface water, both now and into the future, that is a gap, and something that lead local flood authorities or the Environment Agency is not required to do or resourced to manage at the moment, Fiona. So I hope that clarifies, but Sam's given some more details in the chat.
Thank you. And I think that point about resources has also surprisingly come up, and perhaps I can put this to you, Joanna, and then maybe Hannah. Of course, we know that local planning authorities have a really critical role in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation, but we also know that many are struggling in terms of the resource in order to have the expertise or just the staff power to do lots of this. And Joanna, I wondered if there were any reflections from the department that you might be able to share on that.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. So we're acutely aware of the issues with resourcing in local government, particularly in local planning departments. And, you know, thanks particularly to colleagues across the industry who've been really open and contributing to what has become, you know, sort of an industry-wide conversation, particularly in the last couple of months. I've started what we were going to be doing, what we referred to as a skills strategy, as announced in the original white paper, and that work is now mobilising, not least because we've obviously now got the reform and the sort of different aspects of the sort of changes to the planning system in the public domain, so we can start to talk about what that change programme looks like and where we might be able to sort of support organisation, local authorities locally to then deliver. We are already doing quite a lot of pathfinders and pilots, particularly, for example, there's about 40 local authorities engaged in pathfinders on engagement and using digital systems for engagement with communities. We've got the 24 design coding pathfinders as well that are live, and that sort of learning with others is one of our kind of core modes of sort of helping support and also develop sort of appropriate methods that others can then learn from and adapt. But just to say, Fiona, yes, there's a programme of work which is specifically on capacity and capability, and as we've now got the broad package in the public domain, or at least the headlines of it, we're starting to work that through, and we'll be announcing more on that in the future.
Thank you. And Hannah, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that one.
The issue of resources and staffing. Can you hear me better now, by the way?
It's still a little bit muffled. So sorry. I'm conscious we might not be able to fix it in the last 7 minutes, that's all.
Okay, well, hopefully that's a bit better. So yeah, I mean, workforce issues are a really big thing for planners, both the number of staff and the skill set, the range of skills that are held there. So we'll certainly be doing a lot of work working with people like the Association of Local Government Ecologists, for example, to help try and understand the impact for delivering things like biodiversity net gain, which is another aspect of planning policy. But we've been talking to Homes England. They've just put some additional resource into an organisation called Public Practice, which match makes planners from the private sector and puts them into the local government sector, which is a really interesting way of doing things. We're having conversations with individual authorities as well, trying to work out how they are looking to address the issue. I don't have any magic silver bullets at this point in time. Everybody recognises it's a really big issue. It's writ large across all of local government. So we're trying to work our way through it and talking to various people. But yeah, it's a really big issue.
Fiona, can I just come back in on public practice? So the funding we've put in via Homes England is so that they can sort of start to, I suppose, mobilise their programmes sort of across the rest of the country, and they've currently got, in a sense, the sort of invitation out there for local authorities and also for applicants to sort of express an interest and say we'd like to be part of this programme. So I would really encourage colleagues to look at that, and it's not just about planners, it's also about bringing in ecologists, urban designers and others into the public sector. It's a really powerful programme, and if colleagues haven't picked it up, they might just want to sort of Google public practice and have a look at some of the things that they're putting out there. And as Hannah said, we hope that the announcement on the planning fee increase will start to go some way towards addressing these issues. We know it won't go all the way, but if people haven't picked it up, where we've announced increase in planning fees for minor and major planning applications by 35% and 25% respectively in the when we put the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill out to the public domain. And obviously what will follow the bill is then a sort of series of consultations on different aspects of detail, but more of that to come in the near future.
Thank you. And just back to you, Julie, I think for this one, I'm conscious that when one of your sort of requests for reform was around the call-in process, but also you mentioned cause future flood risk as opposed to current flood risk. And there's been some questions about sort of maps available in terms of making sure that actually people can try and future-proof decisions. And I just wondered if you might say a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's an area which we're continuing to develop. So things like I mentioned the digital service, the flood map for planning. As we get more information, we'll just continue to update that, and we've got a commitment to doing that. The other things that I mentioned this briefly, but we've also updated our climate change allowances. So the guidance for planners and developers to follow, so that can reflect the latest climate science. So that's now reflecting sea level rise, river changes, as well as peak rainfall. So it's reflecting quite a number of the different sources of flooding. So we've got guidance around that to help local planning authorities follow as well, Fiona. But as and when we get better data and information, we will continue to do our best to provide that and provide the information around it, because it's another gap issue. In that we are largely preoccupied by current flood risk, which is already quite difficult to contend with, but actually we do need to be better about thinking further ahead in terms of also managing future flood risk. And that's an area where, for example, the call-in direction, which I briefly mentioned, that last resort point, very rarely needed, thank goodness, but it doesn't reflect future flood risk. And it doesn't also include minor development basically as well.
Thank you. And Adam, I know you presented quite a lot of data. Is that something that you feel needs to really come into the system?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a recommendation that the committee are keen on, that we've made before, that development considers kind of 2 and up to 4 degree, or kind of an assessment of 4 degree within kind of flood risk assessment. So yeah, that's something that we think is important.
Thank you. And I'm conscious we've got 3 minutes left, so and we have got quite a lot of questions in the Q&A, so apologies to everyone that I haven't been able to get to, but I did want to just bring up coastal risk assessment as perhaps the final point, because as people have highlighted, the film, I think, doesn't focus on coastal change management areas, but obviously it does talk about the challenges in coastal areas. So Julie, sorry, back to you.
Yeah, totally agree. Happy to, totally agree. It's very, very important. Very important that things like shoreline management plans are reflected in our strategic local plans. Some places are really great at doing this, others less so. I think there was a point in the chat about coastal change management areas. Absolutely, it's there as a mechanism already, one that we do need to take perhaps more seriously and apply more often, actually. So we're working with coastal groups around the country as it stands to update the shoreline management plans to make sure they're fit for the future, reflecting climate adaptation. So as those updates happen, it's really important they get translated into the planning system and they're really closely aligned with strategic local plans. So really welcome point, very well made.
Thank you very much, Julie. I am conscious that it's now 12:59. Somebody's just asked about the recording. So just to reiterate, in case people missed at the beginning, both the film and a recording of today's session will be available on our website shortly. Apologies due to some of the sound difficulties, but I hope that people heard the vast majority of what was discussed, and thank you ever so much for all of the questions and engagement today. Thank you very much to our panelists. It was fantastic to have your input, and I must just comment that if people are willing and able to help us share the film as far and as wide as possible, we would be most grateful. We will be sharing it via our Twitter, which is @TheTCPA, and it's on our website, so please do consider helping us share it. We know, as we said, it's high level and it's entry level, but we think those 3 points that are highlighted in terms of steps that can be taken are a really important initial step. And then, as highlighted through the chat, there is lots more information out there and things that we need to intertwine, and perhaps the review of the National Planning Policy Framework, which is on the horizon, will be an opportunity to really make sure that's embedded. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to our panelists, and I hope everyone has a fantastic afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.